The myth is that he was Sir Galahad wielding the magical sword and slaying all our enemies. The reality was he was willing to negotiate, and that takes a lot of courage.
For some, he was the warrior who sought peace.
His goals were to end the Cold War, and to do so without a nuclear holocaust.
To others, he was the man who ignored the plague of AIDS.
The leader of the free world completely ignored my friends and the people I loved when they were dying.
He built up the military and the deficit.
There was a high cost of what was a very serious fiscal policy mistake.
Yet the man who said government was the problem may be remembered for providing a solution.
Ronald Reagan improved the image of government because he himself seemed to be such an effective president and leader.
Tonight, farewell to a president by his admirers and his critics.
From ABC News. This is Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
There it is, President Reagan's flag-draped coffin lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda. And the first of an estimated couple of 100,000 visitors have begun filing past to pay their respects, to be a little part of history themselves, to satisfy their curiosity. Who knows what all their motives may be. Each former president is surrounded by concentric circles of supporters and admirers. Some of them are family, some are personal friends, political backers, former staffers, cabinet officers. But in each case, the mission is so similar as to be almost identical, ensuring that history delivers the kindest possible judgment. The admirers of John F. Kennedy have been particularly skillful in this regard, elevating his presidency to almost legendary proportions. The friends of President Reagan seem determined to do at least as much for him. It's a distinctly American phenomenon. We mock and malign, we skewer and eviscerate our presidents while they are in power. We get a little misty-eyed about them when they leave office, and then, when they die, we begin the process of mythologizing. It's natural enough that during a week when the nation pays its respects, that most of those reflections be positive. But it cannot be left entirely to the historians to separate myth from reality. If it is not too early for President Reagan's most ardent admirers to begin a campaign to have his likeness carved into Mount Rushmore, then it is not too late to point out that while the man was the object of widespread affection, some of his policies, both foreign and domestic, were not admired in all their aspects when he was still in office. We begin then with a look at Mr. Reagan's domestic policies. Here's Nightline correspondent Michelle Martin.
At an upscale salon in downtown Washington, lunchtime patrons reflect on the legacy of the nation's 40th president.
Whenever I think of President Reagan, I think of freedom. He changed Europe, and in a lot of ways he changed the world.
I thought he did what he needed to do to put us back on the map.
But just a few miles uptown, at a barbershop in the heart of Black Washington, a very different view.
He's never done anything for Black America.
Why do you say that?
Why do I say that? Because a lot of programs, when he got in office for Black youth or whatever, he cut.
On the day when President Reagan's remains arrived in Washington, debate over his policies was muted out of respect, but the differences of opinion were almost as stark as when he was in office. There were those who saw him as the man who helped America rediscover its best self. There were others who saw him as one who did the most for those who needed it least.
He represented the Republican view, and the Republican view, unfortunately, in my opinion, has been that there is a privileged class and there is an unprivileged class, and they don't care about the unprivileged class.
While much of the discussion of the president's legacy has focused on his staunch opposition to communism, his approach to domestic policy was equally clear and unequivocal.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
And at the center of his domestic agenda was his economic policy, which came to be known as Reaganomics.
Reaganomics means the theory that you can cut taxes a lot especially income tax rates, that it will be good for the economy and that deficits don't matter.
Are you entitled to the fruits of your own labor? Or does government have some presumptive right to spend and spend and spend?
That massive decrease of the marginal tax rate from 75% down into the 20s set off an economic expansion and the creation of 20 million new jobs. But in some ways, and maybe even more importantly, it made tax cuts the holy grail of the Republican Party.
But critics contend that the costs and benefits were never evenly distributed. While cutting taxes, Mr. Reagan initiated a major increase in military spending, creating a huge budget deficit. That put upward pressure on already high interest rates. And his legendary skepticism about big government led to cuts in an array of programs, including job training, student loans, and welfare.
The economy was changing, but he reinforced the difficulties of low-income people.
I think the worst thing that the administration did was to promote selfishness in the name of individualism and responsibility. There are some Americans who need and deserve the nation's concern and help.
The charge that he was callous or didn't care or was oblivious to the needs of lower income people, I always felt was a bum rap. He believed very strongly that those welfare programs, for example, weren't working.
The contrasting impressions of the Reagan years can be seen in the memories of these two men of roughly equal age. Okay, what do you remember your parents saying about Reagan?
My parents saying, if we can only get through this time, we'll be a much better place after the second term.
After he's gone.
After he's out of office. And that was kind of the theme of the community.
I can recall my parents and their friends certainly talking about the boom times of the 80s because it really was a substantial period of growth for some Americans, not all, but for them definitely. I certainly remember that.
Among some, the disenchantment about Mr. Reagan's economic policies extends to his civil rights record, beginning with Mr. Reagan's 1980 campaign visit to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers were murdered years before.
Now, I know people have been telling me that Jimmy Carter's doing his best, and that's our problem.
And he said, then he gave the code word, I'm for states' rights. He said in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Well, for states' rights means let the states do whatever they want with black people. Get the federal hand off their backs.
And many AIDS activists remain bitter because they contend his administration failed to recognize the severity of the AIDS crisis, which took full root during the 80s.
Mr. Reagan did not say the word AIDS for the first 7 years of his entire administration. While tens of thousands of people were dying and millions were becoming infected, Mr. Reagan was deliberately silent for 7 years.
I think the criticism of the president in this area, again, comes mostly from a movement that vehemently disagreed not only with President Reagan, but with the values of the people who elected him.
How much will you take for the place?
Oh, you can't sell heaven.
Whatever Mr. Reagan's policies, it is certainly a measure of his political skills that his toughest critics found in him much to admire.
He had a few simple ideas: strengthen the military, cut taxes, and he kept on those ideas and didn't waver. And I think people admired that strength and that single-mindedness even when they didn't agree with him.
His sunny optimism and his morning in America speeches and attitude, I think, made Americans feel better about themselves and better about their country.
And thus, for all the conflicts and controversies of Mr. Reagan's presidency, it is the memory of his optimism, charm, and love of country that for many endures. This is Michelle Martin for Nightline in Washington.
President Reagan came into office with firmly held views but minimal experience in foreign affairs. His successes and failures on the world stage when we come back.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by IBM.
Okay, people, why are these numbers off?
Well, Tim, it's been an off week.
An off quarter.
We got off to a bad start.
The budgets were off.
Way off.
Forecasts were off.
Off target.
Way off. Production was off.
Way off.
Well, Patterson's research was off. Where is Patterson?
He took the week off.
Look, can someone just tell me how we can turn off?
How about an off-site?
That's awful.
Need some new thinking? IBM Business Consultants can help.
We filled this tent with 10,000 hungry mosquitoes and biting flies. That was me over 15 years ago, before the threat of West Nile virus. I was protected by Deep Woods Off. Today, I still trust Off, because you can't beat the DEET in today's Off Deep Woods. It's like a shield against hungry, biting mosquitoes, including those that may carry West Nile virus. No, you just can't beat the DEET in Off Deep Woods.
S.E. Johnson, a family company.
Thinking about refinancing your home? Call AmeriQuest now. You'll get your own personal loan specialist.
Whenever you call me, I'll be there.
Someone who knows you are more than your credit score. Who can help you pay off your high-interest credit cards and lower your monthly payments. We even do the paperwork. Call 1-800-AmeriQuest now or go to AmeriQuest.com. AmeriQuest, the company that knows you are more.
Stunned Detroit with a three-pointer that turned the tide for the Lakers and even the series.
From way outside. Got it!
Can the Pistons recover in Game 3? The NBA Finals on ABC. Thursday night. Coverage begins at 8:30 Eastern.
Nobody takes it to extremes like Toyota. Extreme quality. The best in its class. Extreme value with up to 40 miles to the gallon. And extreme savings with 0% financing on any new Corolla or $1,000 cash back. Or get 0% or $1,000 back on Matrix. Because at the end of the day, it's not a great deal unless it's a great car. And you don't have to go to extremes to get it. See your Toyota dealer before it all ends, July 6th.
Right now, during Ford's Get What You Want sales event, you can get the Ford you've always wanted. And for the first time ever, get up to $5,000 cash back or choose 0% for 60 months on Ford Explorer, Expedition, or Excursion. During Ford's Get What You Want sales event, get the Explorer, Expedition, or Excursion you want with up to $5,000 cash back or choose 0% for 60 months. Get the best selection of Ford SUVs with up to $5,000 cash back. Drop into your local Ford dealer during the Get What You Want sales event.
When President Reagan came into the White House, the country had just been through the humiliation of the protracted Iran hostage crisis. The Cold War was in its fourth decade. Here's ABC News senior correspondent Jim Wooten.
So help you God.
So help me God. Right from the start, it was clear that Ronald Reagan's foreign policy credentials were equally as unimpressive as his predecessors. He brought no particular experience in matters beyond America's borders and no particular knack for dealing with them. And yet, scholar and journalist Les Gelb has considerable admiration for Mr. Reagan's adaptability in foreign policy, especially toward the Cold War Kremlin.
I think Ronald Reagan, contrary to the myth created by a lot of his fellow conservatives, Ronald Reagan was a hawk and a dove. And quite purposefully and admittedly so. He was a hawk. He was in favor of military buildup, U.S. military strength. He was also in favor of negotiations and compromise. And that's sort of the essence of what he did with the Soviet Union.
What he did with the Soviet Union. That would be everybody's choice as his crowning achievement. And that, says a former White House assistant, that had been on Mr. Reagan's mind for a long time.
Before he ever came to office, he told his friends, including me, that his objective was, the most important thing he wanted to accomplish as president was ending the Cold War. He understood we live at the hinges of history. By the end of this century, the world will be all communist or all free. And then his attitude is, therefore, let's decide it's going to be free. Let's win this thing.
It was for Mr. Reagan just that simple. In fact, that's what he always said it was, simple. Here's a quote from him on the subject, short and sweet. About the Cold War, we win and they lose. Of course, it wasn't that simple at all, but in the end, as a matter of fact, we did win and they did lose. As a long-time, hard-line anti-communist, His determination to end the Cold War was based on his moral certainty that the Soviet government was a wicked bunch.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
His military budget, he said,
"It is part of a careful long-term plan to make America strong again after too many years of neglect and mistakes. We maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression."
But Mr. Reagan was aggressive too, not content to allow the Soviets and their surrogates free rein. In Afghanistan, millions of American dollars and weapons for Mujahideen fighting Russian troops. In Central America, expensive aid and comfort for the effort of Nicaraguan rebels to overthrow a leftist government. And as a centerpiece of his Cold War strategy, the Strategic Defense Initiative, immediately named Star Wars, a missile system designed to shoot down Soviet missiles from space. It would cost billions just to begin the research. But, he said,
"Our only purpose, one all people share, is to search for ways to reduce the danger of nuclear war."
There was another purpose, to break the Soviet bank, to put so much economic pressure on an already fragile system, it would be impossible for it to match U.S. military spending dollar for dollar.
We were pouring $11 trillion of the treasure of the United States into the Cold War fighting communism. And I think that Reagan actually pressed on that very hard. And the truth is that the Soviet Union was bankrupt and broke, and we were lucky to have a Mikhail Gorbachev who was willing to negotiate rather than let the missiles fly.
And so the final chapters were written.
"Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
And soon after Mr. Reagan left office, the wall came down, and quite soon, so did the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. We win, they lose. Though in foreign affairs, things did not always turn out that rosy for Mr. Reagan. When 241 Marines were killed in a single terrorist explosion in Beirut, he first vowed to keep them there.
If we were to leave Lebanon now, what message would that send to those who foment instability and terrorism?
And 3 months later, he withdrew the Marines in Beirut to ships offshore, which surprised many, including reporter Haynes Johnson.
But he was a much more pragmatic guy than I think that we give him credit for today. And that was an example of how he was willing to change course, and it didn't affect his standing in the country.
But Mr. Gelb says, to this day,
a lot of Americans who served in Beirut at that time feel that that was a terrible mistake, maybe even greater than Clinton's withdrawal from Somalia after the Rangers were killed in Mogadishu.
Colonel North, please rise.
Another low point, the Iran-Contra scandal, the sale of weapons to Iran, illegal, in exchange for American hostages in Lebanon, with the proceeds going to the Contras, the rebels in Nicaragua, also illegal. Mr. Reagan said he knew nothing about it, but took the blame and the responsibility anyway. There was also the matter of South Africa, where blacks were fighting apartheid, and Reagan adopted a rather benign economic strategy regarded by many black South Africans as an insult to the dignity of their struggle. So in foreign affairs, how does Mr. Reagan stack up? Well, it's no accident that in the polling at the end of his term, he received positive marks only on foreign policy and defense, nothing else. Communism was his arch enemy. He fought it. He won. Simple. Jim Wooten for Nightline in Washington.
Taking stock of the Reagan legacy with one of his biographers when we come back.
Meanwhile, at dinner.
Our network's been down for 2 days.
Internet worm.
Whoa.
Our sales took a pounding. How did yours do?
It hit our suppliers.
You can never catch up.
Oh, the twin brothers doom and gloom.
Jeff, you're awfully quiet.
Our network didn't go down.
No.
No? No. And get the check.
Keeping business up and running. This is the power of the network. Now.
Hey, honey.
Hey, just think of what we can do with all the money we're saving.
Well, I have been giving it some thought.
Really?
Yeah. Prices you gotta see. Circuit City's the place for amazing digital cameras at great low prices. Right now, save $50 on this Sony 3.2 megapixel digital camera with 2x optical zoom. Now an incredible $179.99 only at Circuit City.
There are some things you really miss when you're on a low-carb diet. Like your bowls, your spoons, and the crispy crunch of cereal. But this new Special K changes everything. It's time to raise a spoon to 9 net carbs that taste better than 9 net carbs have any right to. New from Special K. Take back your bowl.
Shocking celebrity gossip.
Jennifer Lopez married Mark Anthony. Actually, J-Lo married several people last week. She keeps her wedding dress in the trunk of her car.
Tonight, ABC's George Lopez and an all-new Jimmy Kimmel Live. ABC coming up.
Depend on Lisa Patton and News 2 Storm Tracker. Severe weather season is here, and Lisa Patton delivers the information you need when you need it most. When severe weather strikes, depend on Lisa Patton and News 2 Storm Tracker.
Introducing the Nissan Quest, a revolutionary minivan featuring 5 Skyview windows, front and side impact 5-star safety rating, an innovative center console, automated side and rear lift doors, and fold-away second and third row seats. Moms have changed. Shouldn't the minivan?
Every night, play along with the Tennessee Lottery Cash 3 drawings live on News 2. Will the balls fall your way? Watch the Cash 3 drawings live every night at 6:28, only on News 2.
And joining me now, Lou Cannon, a veteran journalist, White House correspondent who covered Reagan for more than 25 years, and the author of what is arguably the best of the Reagan biographies, President Reagan, The Role of a Lifetime. Lou Cannon, see if you can sort of separate the journalist from the historian. Historically, how do you think he'll be judged?
I think Ronald Reagan will be judged as a good and effective president. I've never been too much on these numerical rankings. You know, the historians started ranking him, I think, in the 30s. The last ranking I saw, he was somewhere from 6 through 8. But I think he's going to be well thought of, thought of as an important president at least, if only because he was the first 2-term president who completed his full 2 terms that we had after Dwight Eisenhower. We had all these presidencies that were ruined in some ways. So Reagan had a chance to leave a mark that his predecessors had not left.
There is something, Lou, particularly symbolic about having your face carved into Mount Rushmore. There are very few of our presidents up there. Do you think that will one day happen? In other words, does Mr. Reagan rise to Rushmore-like proportions?
I think if we keep the nuclear peace, he probably does, because as far, I think, as history is concerned, and I will say, frankly, not to put it off on history, as far as I'm concerned, the fact that we ended the Cold War without a nuclear accident. People always say, who won the Cold War? Well, the answer to that is we all won the Cold War. And if we, in fact, keep the nuclear peace, I think he'd be in Mount Rushmore. And if we don't, it won't matter, because there probably won't be any Mount Rushmore.
As Michelle Martin showed us earlier in this broadcast, in the African-American community, he is viewed with considerably less affection and admiration than he is within the white community. Justifiable, do you believe?
I think there's certainly a reason for it. Ronald Reagan believed in integration. He was against prejudice. He'd campaigned for putting for breaking the color, ending the color line and the color barrier in baseball long before Jackie Robinson actually did it. But he didn't believe in giving
what he would have called special preference to anyone, no matter what had happened to them in the past. Therefore, he didn't believe in affirmative action. And the African American community was very much committed, I think is still very much committed to affirmative action. So Ronald Reagan was always on a collision course, at least with the leaders of the African American community. And no, I don't think they think particularly well of him, and I would imagine that will continue.
In so many ways, Lou, and this will be my last question, he seemed like the most gregarious of our presidents, and yet I have talked to a number of people who had access to him on a fairly regular basis, as you must have done in all those years that you covered the White House and later on when you were writing your biography of Reagan. Was he indeed as easy to know as that initial gregarious personality seemed to suggest?
Behind Ronald Reagan's affable facade, there was a very smart and disciplined, calculating politician, and a man who was aloof and reserved, who kept himself to himself in many ways. He never became too chummy with anybody. He never became anybody's pal. He was always seeing what the main chance was in life, and that made him a better president and a better politician, but it didn't make him easier to know.
Lou Cannon, I thank you very much. I appreciate you joining us, and thank you for your insights. I'll be back in a moment.